Introduction. Amid the ashes of the 1992 Los Angeles riots, a beaten and broken man named Rodney King famously pleaded with the public, asking if we could all just get along. The phrase has since echoed through the decades, often reduced to a cynical punchline or a hollow cliché. Yet, beneath the cultural kitsch lies a profound and desperately urgent question, one that applies today more than ever, not merely to the fractures of race, but to the bitter and seemingly insurmountable divides of modern politics. Our civic discourse often resembles a combat zone, with partisans entrenched in hostile camps, utterly convinced of their own infallible virtue. King's plea included a deeper realization. We are all stranded on this earth together for a fleeting moment, so we might as well attempt to figure out a way to coexist. The fundamental inquiry here is why humanity is so prone to fracturing into opposing tribes, each radiating an absolute certainty in its own correctness. To understand everything from the collapse of political cooperation to the fervent clashes over faith, one must look through the lens of moral psychology. Morality is not a secondary human trait. It is the foundational capacity that allowed our ancestors to transcend the savage competition of nature and build complex, peaceful civilizations. By exploring the deep architecture of human nature, it becomes possible to approach the perennially forbidden topics of polite conversation, politics and religion, with a renewed sense of wonder rather than the customary anger. These realms are not aberrations. They are the purest expressions of our underlying psychological design. The ultimate aim must be to drain the venom from these debates, replacing hostility with a profound curiosity about the miraculous evolutionary mechanisms that allow us to live together at all. The human mind is intricately designed to process moral questions, much as it is wired for language or physical survival. But the mind is not merely moral, it is relentlessly moralistic, highly critical, and fiercely judgmental. The term righteous carries ancient connotations of justice and virtue, but it is inescapably bound to a sense of outraged justice and an intolerance for those who transgress. An obsession with righteousness and the inevitable self-righteousness that accompanies it is not a flaw in our cognitive machinery. It is a brilliant, evolved feature. This very righteousness is the adhesive that binds non-relatives into massive cooperative societies, allowing us to build nations. Yet, the same glue that binds us guarantees perpetual moralistic conflict. Eradicating this conflict entirely is an impossible dream, but achieving a society where competing moral visions are held in a productive balance and where accountability restrains human excess is a realistic and vital ambition. To grasp the full picture of our moral nature, one must understand three fundamental principles of human psychology. The first is that our initial intuitions dictate our judgments, while our strategic, conscious reasoning follows behind. We do not use moral reasoning to objectively seek the truth. Rather, our reasoning acts as a defense attorney, scrambling to justify the gut feelings that arose instantly. The mind is akin to a small, conscious rider sitting atop a massive, unconscious elephant. The rider's job is not to direct the elephant, but to serve it, rationalizing its movements and defending its social agenda. The second principle reveals that the moral domain is vastly broader than modern secular society typically acknowledges. The righteous mind can be compared to a tongue equipped with an array of distinct taste receptors. While modern secular morality relies almost entirely on the receptors for preventing harm and ensuring fairness, human nature possesses other powerful receptors, those attuned to liberty, loyalty, authority, and the sacred. Political movements that appeal to this wider palette inherently possess an advantage, speaking to a deeper and more comprehensive spectrum of human moral intuition. The final principle demonstrates that morality simultaneously binds us together and blinds us to other perspectives. Human beings are forged by natural selection operating at two levels: the individual competing against peers, which breeds selfishness and hypocrisy, and the group competing against other groups, which fosters intense cooperation and sacrifice. We are primate minds overlaid with a hive switch. Under the right conditions, we can silence our petty self-interest and dissolve into a larger collective, committing acts of profound altruism or, conversely, horrific violence in the name of the group. From this perspective, religion is not a parasitic delusion, but a profound evolutionary adaptation that binds communities together through shared moral narratives. Yet, once we accept the narrative of our chosen tribe, whether political or religious, we become entirely blind to the moral truths valued by anyone outside our matrix. The ultimate realization is an ancient one. We are all hypocrites, completely blind to the enormous logs in our own eyes while aggressively pointing out the tiny specks in the eyes of our neighbors. A truly enlightened perspective demands that we step back from the ceaseless, divisive struggle of being inherently for or against. By applying the tools of moral psychology, we can finally begin to analyze the profound game we are all unknowingly playing within our own righteous minds and among our endlessly warring righteous groups. Chapter 1. Where does morality come from? Imagine reading a short story about a family whose dog is accidentally killed by a car. Upon hearing that dog meat is quite delicious, they decide to butcher the animal, cook it, and eat it for dinner in the complete privacy of their own home. Did they commit a moral wrong? If you belong to the highly educated classes of Western society, you might feel a sudden flash of disgust, but you would likely hesitate to call the act immoral. After all, the animal was already dead, it belonged to the family, and no one else was harmed. You might find it repulsive, but you would probably grant them the right to do it. Now consider an even more challenging scenario. A man buys a chicken from the supermarket, brings it home, and has sexual intercourse with the carcass before cooking and eating it. Once again, there is no victim, and the act is performed in total secrecy. The disgust is far stronger here, yet many politically liberal thinkers will offer a similar verdict, acknowledging the man's right to do as he pleases in private, provided he causes no harm to anyone else. However, to the vast majority of the people on the planet, such actions are profoundly and undeniably wrong. For them, morality is broad. Some things are wrong even if no one is hurt. Recognizing this fundamental global variation in moral perception is the crucial first step toward understanding the righteous mind. The next step requires an exploration of where all these diverse moralities actually came from. When searching for the origin of morality, the prevailing psychological theories of the late 20th century largely framed the question around how children develop an understanding of right and wrong. Traditionally, there were two opposing answers. The nativist perspective argued that moral knowledge is innate, arriving preloaded in our minds by divine inscription or evolutionary design. The empiricist perspective countered that children are born as blank slates, meaning that morality is entirely a product of nurture, learned through experience and adult instruction. However, developmental psychology in the late 1980s was largely dominated by a third approach known as rationalism. Drawing on the foundational work of the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget, rationalists argued that children figure out morality for themselves. Just as children learn the laws of physics by playing with water glasses, independently realizing that volume remains constant regardless of the container's shape, they learn the rules of fairness by playing games with their peers. Through turn-taking and resolving playground disputes, children construct their own understanding of justice. Kohlberg expanded upon Piaget's ideas, devising a system to quantify children's moral reasoning by presenting them with dilemmas, such as whether a man should steal an unaffordable drug to save his dying wife. Kohlberg discovered a 6-stage progression in moral development. Young children judge actions by superficial features like the threat of punishment. During the conventional stages, they become adept at navigating rules and respecting authority. Finally, in adolescence, some individuals reach a post-conventional stage where they evaluate rules against universal principles of justice, acting essentially as young moral philosophers. This rationalist framework quickly became a cornerstone of psychological study, establishing what could be described as the liberal consensus. Kohlberg's research indicated that children reached the highest stages of moral development not by submitting to the authority of parents and teachers, but by engaging in egalitarian peer relationships that required role-taking and perspective-shifting. Authority and hierarchy were therefore viewed as obstacles to moral maturation. This scientific narrative emerged just as the baby boomer generation was entering academia, providing a psychological foundation for a secular, questioning, and egalitarian worldview. It equated the ultimate pinnacle of moral development with a progressive dedication to justice and individual rights. Seeking an easier test to measure moral understanding without relying on the complex verbal articulation required by Kohlberg's dilemmas, Elliot Turiel devised a method involving short, simple stories about rule-breaking. He asked children yes or no questions about arbitrary rules, such as wearing casual clothes to a school that required a uniform, and contrasted them with scenarios involving harm, such as a child pushing another off a swing. He discovered that even 5-year-olds easily distinguish between the two. They recognize that rules about clothing are changeable social conventions, but they insist that rules preventing harm are absolute and universal. This led to the conclusion that the foundation of all moral development is the child's independent realization that harm is intrinsically wrong. Morality, in this view, is strictly defined by matters of justice, rights, and welfare. Meanwhile, in the rest of the world, anthropologists were uncovering realities that clashed entirely with this cerebral, harm-based model. Anthropological ethnographies detailed societies where morality was an intensely passionate, all-encompassing force, inextricably linked to concepts of purity, pollution, and the supernatural. The Azande of Sudan governed their social relations through an intricate fear of witchcraft. The Ilongot of the Philippines channeled group tensions into organized headhunting. The Hua of New Guinea maintained a complex religion of the body, governed by strict food taboos connected to bodily fluids and gender. Even the ancient Hebrew Bible dedicates vast sections to rules concerning menstruation, the handling of corpses, and the prohibition of eating swarming insects. These practices are driven not by an abstract concern for individual rights, but by the powerful emotion of disgust and the desire to maintain physical and spiritual purity. It became evident that the individualistic secular moral order of the West was a historical anomaly. If morality is universally constructed by children solely on the basis of harm, how could one explain the profound, emotion-laden moralization of harmless bodily practices in nearly every other culture on Earth? This question ignited a great debate between psychological rationalists and cultural anthropologists. Richard Schwader argued that all societies must decide how to balance the needs of the individual against the needs of the group. The West embraced an individualistic answer, subordinating society to the rights of the individual, which inevitably shrinks the moral domain strictly to issues of harm and fairness. However, most traditional societies adopted a sociocentric answer, prioritizing the group and integrating morality into every facet of daily life. Schwader tested this by interviewing individuals in Chicago and the ancient city of Bhubaneswar in India. While both groups condemned obvious instances of harm, the Indian participants also issued fierce moral condemnations of harmless actions, such as a widow eating fish or a son addressing his father by his first name. They did not view these as mere social conventions. They perceived them as universal moral absolutes. In Orissa, the social order itself was the moral order. Rationalists countered by arguing that these findings merely reflected different informational assumptions. If Indians believed that a widow eating fish would inflame her sexual passions and offend her dead husband's spirit, then they were still condemning the act based on perceived harm, albeit a supernatural one. To settle this dispute, it was necessary to create scenarios involving disgust and disrespect that meticulously removed any possibility of a victim, testing whether people would still moralize the behavior while controlling for harm. This led to a large-scale cross-cultural study involving adults and children from diverse social classes in 2 Brazilian cities, Porto Alegre and Recife, as well as in Philadelphia. The scenarios utilized the harmless taboo violations introduced earlier, such as using a national flag to clean a toilet or eating a privately owned, already dead pet. The results strongly supported Schwader's sociocentric theory. While highly educated Americans treated these scenarios as bizarre but morally permissible violations of social convention, working-class Americans and Brazilians overwhelmingly condemned them as absolute moral transgressions. Unexpectedly, the effect of social class was much larger than the effect of city, meaning that well-educated people across all 3 cities were more similar to each other than they were to their lower-class neighbors. Crucially, this moral condemnation persisted even when participants explicitly acknowledged that no one had been harmed. The moral domain is highly variable across cultures and social classes, extending far beyond the narrow confines of harm and fairness. Children cannot possibly construct these elaborate moral frameworks purely from a rational analysis of suffering. The most revealing aspect of these interviews was the phenomenon of inventing victims. When confronted with harmless taboo violations, people did not coldly calculate the absence of harm. Instead, they condemned the actions instantly and then frantically searched for a victim to justify their gut feeling. They would propose highly improbable harms, suggesting that a family might become violently ill from eating cooked dog meat, or that torn pieces of a flag would cause a severe plumbing disaster. When the interviewer gently reminded them of the facts of the story, that the meat was safe or the plumbing secure, they did not retract their moral condemnation. Instead, they exhibited moral dumbfounding. They were left speechless, stubbornly clinging to their judgment while admitting they could not logically explain it. They were engaging in reasoning, but it was not a search for truth. It was a desperate effort to defend an emotional reaction that had already taken place. As the philosopher David Hume famously declared centuries ago, reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions. The attempt to trace the origins of morality strictly through the lens of rationalism and an evolving understanding of harm is insufficient. The moral domain is not universally narrow. It is broad and variable, encompassing intense intuitions about disgust and disrespect that defy logical categorization. People possess visceral, gut-level reactions to certain actions, and these immediate feelings drive the reasoning process that follows. Reasoning is not a pristine mechanism for uncovering moral truth. It is a post hoc fabrication, a defense attorney hastily assembling arguments to justify a verdict that has already been delivered by the emotions. We are born equipped to be righteous, but it is our surrounding culture that teaches us exactly what to be righteous about. Chapter 2. The Intuitive Dog and its Rational Tail. It is a profound psychological reality that human beings are internally divided, often finding themselves torn between conflicting impulses. The ancient Roman poet Ovid beautifully captured this struggle when he described a character who saw and approved of the right path, yet was dragged by a mysterious force toward the wrong one. Ancient philosophers provided an array of metaphors for this inner conflict, perhaps none more vivid than the one offered in Plato's dialogue Timaeus. In this philosophical myth, a divine creator fashions perfect rational souls and encases them in spherical vessels, our heads. However, to navigate the physical world, these heads required bodies, which were animated by a secondary, mortal soul, brimming with unruly passions, fears, and desires. To prevent the divine rational soul from being entirely corrupted by the body's foolish counsel, the gods instituted a physical buffer, the neck. This myth perfectly encapsulates what might be called the rationalist delusion, the deeply held Western ideal that reason is our supreme faculty and ought to be the absolute master of our emotions. This rationalist fantasy has cast a long shadow, running from Plato straight through to modern thinkers like Immanuel Kant and Lawrence Kohlberg. When a concept like reason is elevated to sacred status, it blinds its followers to reality. It took the Scottish philosopher David Hume to smash this idol, famously asserting that reason is merely the servant of the passions. Decades later, Thomas Jefferson proposed a middle ground, writing a poetic letter to a married woman he had fallen for. In his letter, Jefferson staged a debate between the head and the heart, ultimately suggesting that they are co-emperors with distinct domains. The head manages science and calculation, while the heart rules the realm of human connection and morality. Thus, history leaves us with three models of the mind: Plato's rational master, Hume's obedient servant, and Jefferson's divided empire. These early thinkers lacked the ultimate key to unlocking human nature, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Darwin himself was deeply interested in morality and recognized that human cooperation, driven by innate moral emotions like sympathy and a desire for social standing, was vital for survival. He viewed morality as an evolved capacity. However, as the 20th century progressed, the social sciences vehemently turned against the idea of innate human nature. The horrors of social Darwinism, which was manipulated to justify eugenics and the atrocities of the Holocaust, made the very concept of biological innateness morally toxic. Later, the radical academic movements of the 1960s and 1970s further entrenched the belief that humans are blank slates, arguing that any biological constraints would hinder the utopian pursuit of absolute equality. In this hostile climate, the Harvard biologist Edward O. Wilson published his groundbreaking work Sociobiology in 1975, arguing that evolutionary pressures shape animal behavior and, inevitably, human behavior as well. Wilson bravely suggested that moral philosophers were deceiving themselves by believing they were discovering objective, transcendental truths about rights and justice. In reality, he argued, they were simply consulting their own emotional brain centers and fabricating intellectual justifications afterward. Wilson predicted that ethics would eventually be integrated into the biological sciences, a prophecy that earned him vicious attacks, accusations of fascism, and intense public protests from academics who demanded ideological conformity over scientific inquiry. By the late 1980s, the intellectual landscape had frozen into a paradigm that viewed moral psychology purely as a matter of cognitive reasoning. Yet a quiet revolution was gathering momentum outside the boundaries of developmental psychology. Primatologists like Frans de Waal began demonstrating that our closest ape relatives display the clear emotional building blocks of morality, such as sympathy and conflict resolution. Simultaneously, neuroscientist Antonio Damasio published striking findings about patients who had suffered localized brain damage that completely wiped out their emotional capacities. Remarkably, these individuals retained their full intelligence and ability to reason logically. If Plato had been right, releasing the rational mind from the grip of the passions should have produced perfectly enlightened beings. Instead, Damasio's patients saw their lives fall apart. Deprived of the subtle emotional nudges that help us evaluate options, they became paralyzed by simple decisions and behaved with shocking social ineptitude. They proved that reason cannot function without the guiding hand of emotion. Jefferson's co-emperor model was also insufficient. When the heart died, the head was left totally incapacitated. Seeking to test these models experimentally, new approaches in the 1990s began to challenge the supremacy of conscious reasoning. If reason and emotion are truly separate pathways to moral judgment, then burdening a person's cognitive capacity should impair their ability to make moral decisions. Yet, experiments demonstrated that people deliver moral verdicts just as swiftly and confidently, even when their conscious minds are entirely distracted by memorization tasks. The judgments simply do not rely on the heavy lifting of conscious logic. To probe this further, researchers designed scenarios designed to evoke strong disgust without causing any objective harm. Participants were asked if it would be acceptable to sip a completely sterilized cockroach from a cup of juice, or to sign a fake, legally void contract selling their soul for $2. Despite knowing the actions carried no real consequences, the vast majority flatly refused. When pressed to explain why, they openly admitted they were just following their gut feelings. However, the phenomenon grew even more fascinating when participants were presented with stories of harmless taboo violations, such as adult siblings using dual contraception to have a single private sexual encounter, or a woman cooking and eating a piece of an already incinerated human cadaver. These scenarios triggered intense moral condemnation. As interviewers systematically dismantled every logical objection the participants raised, pointing out that no one was hurt and no risk of pregnancy existed, the participants did not change their minds. Instead, they exhibited what is known as moral dumbfounding. They grasped for new, increasingly absurd rationalizations, ultimately stammering that they just knew the act was wrong, even if they could not articulate why. This behavior strongly echoed the insights of Howard Margolis, a scholar who observed that human cognition operates on two vastly different levels. For millions of years, animal brains have relied on rapid, unconscious pattern recognition, a phenomenon of instantly seeing that a situation is good or bad, much like falling victim to a visual illusion, where you perceive something instantly regardless of what you logically know. Only recently, with the advent of language, did humans develop the capacity for reasoning why, the conscious, effortful process of formulating explanations to justify our intuitions to others. When subjects read about siblings having a sexual encounter, their unconscious pattern matching instantly flags it as repulsive. The conscious mind is then dispatched to assemble a plausible argument for the public. Judgment and justification are entirely separate mental operations. Recognizing this reality requires abandoning the outdated dichotomy of emotion versus cognition. Emotions themselves are a form of rapid information processing. The true divide is between intuition and reasoning. The mind operates like a massive intuitive elephant, carrying a small, conscious rider. The rider was not evolved to command the elephant. Rather, it evolved to serve as the elephant's public relations agent. The rider observes the elephant's automatic leanings and immediately begins crafting persuasive justifications for those movements. We engage in moral reasoning not to discover the objective truth of a matter, but to convince others to join our side. This model explains why political and moral debates are so perpetually maddening. We mistakenly believe that presenting a flawless logical argument will force our opponents to change their minds. But attacking a person's reasoning is merely wagging the dog's tail to try and make the dog happy. If the underlying intuition, the elephant, does not move, the rider will simply invent a new argument to replace the defeated one. To truly change minds, one must speak directly to the elephant. The legendary advice of Dale Carnegie, who urged people to smile, listen, and avoid direct confrontation, was not mere salesmanship. It was profound moral psychology. By approaching others with warmth and empathy, we invite their elephants to lean toward us rather than brace for an attack. When we bypass our combat mode and attempt to see the world from another's perspective, we create the only conditions under which actual persuasion and mutual understanding becomes possible. Chapter 3. Elephant's Rule. It is remarkably easy to catch ourselves in the act of chronic, everyday deception if we simply pay attention to our immediate reactions to criticism. Consider a domestic scenario. A spouse casually but firmly asks why dirty dishes have been left on the counter yet again. Before the conscious mind can fully process the accusation, the mouth is already moving, delivering a seamless, highly plausible excuse involving a crying baby, a barking dog, and an unprecedented convergence of household emergencies. The lie is constructed and delivered so rapidly that both the speaker and the listener might actually believe it. This is the inner lawyer, the rider, leaping to the defense of the elephant before the elephant has even fully registered the terrain. This phenomenon of automatic self-righteousness is perfectly illustrated by an experiment involving hypnosis. Subjects were hypnotized to feel a sudden flash of disgust whenever they read a specific mundane word such as take or often. Upon waking, they read stories containing moral violations, some of which included their hidden trigger word. Predictably, the trigger word made their moral judgments noticeably harsher. However, the true revelation occurred when they read a story about a student council president named Dan, who was organizing a completely innocuous discussion group. For the subjects whose trigger word was embedded in Dan's story, the hypnotic disgust flared up. Unable to find an actual moral violation, a third of these subjects condemned Dan anyway, fabricating absurd rationalizations, claiming he was a popularity-seeking snob or that he just seemed like he was up to something. They experienced a gut feeling and instantly deployed their reasoning to justify it. Ancient sages like Jesus and Buddha understood this deeply, warning their followers about the ease with which we see the faults of others while remaining entirely blind to our own. To understand this automatic self-righteousness, we must examine the underlying mechanisms of the mind. Brains evaluate instantly and constantly. The fundamental question of animal life is simple: approach or avoid. To survive, brains must evaluate everything in their environment instantly, categorizing every object, sound, and entity as a potential threat or a potential benefit. In the late 19th century, Wilhelm Wundt articulated the doctrine of affective primacy, noting that every perception is accompanied by a tiny, almost imperceptible flash of positive or negative feeling. We know if we like or dislike a person we haven't seen in years within a fraction of a second, long before we can consciously remember their name or how we know them. Decades later, Robert Zions revived this concept, demonstrating that people will rate arbitrary, meaningless symbols more favorably simply because they have been exposed to them multiple times, a phenomenon known as the mere exposure effect. Thinking and reasoning are evolutionarily recent additions, but this rapid, effective processing is ancient and powerful. It forces the universe of alternatives to shrink instantly, guiding the conscious mind toward a predetermined direction before conscious thought even begins. Social and political judgments are particularly intuitive. This rapid evaluation can be measured precisely through affective priming. If you flash a negative word like hate on a screen for a fraction of a second, followed by a positive word like sunshine, it takes a person slightly longer to categorize sunshine as good because their mind was already leaning toward negativity. This psychological mechanism is the foundation of the implicit association test, IAT, which reveals that people often possess unconscious, automatic negative reactions to various social groups, regardless of their stated egalitarian values. This intuitive lean is particularly pronounced in politics. When political partisans are shown words associated with their own party or opposing parties, their brainwaves reveal instant unconscious evaluations. The elephant knows exactly which way to lean when it sees a politically loaded word, and we naturally gravitate toward those whose elephants sway in sync with our own. These snap judgments are so powerful that they can even predict the outcomes of elections. Research by Alex Todorov demonstrates that when people are shown pairs of photographs of competing politicians for just 1/10 of a second, their instantaneous, gut-level judgments of which candidate looks more competent predict the actual winner of the election with remarkable accuracy. Our bodies guide our judgments. The mind is not an isolated, rational computer. It is inextricably linked to the physical body. The olfactory nerve, for instance, connects directly to the insular cortex, a primitive brain region that processes taste and smell to protect animals from toxins. In humans, this region has expanded its duties to process moral disgust. To prove how deeply the physical body influences moral judgment, researcher Alex Jordan secretly sprayed a foul-smelling fart spray into a trash can near pedestrians before asking them to answer a survey on controversial moral issues. Those breathing the foul air delivered significantly harsher moral judgments. Similarly, the simple act of physical cleansing can alter our moral compass. Subjects asked to wash their hands with soap become temporarily more moralistic about issues of purity. Conversely, recalling a personal moral failing triggers an unconscious desire to physically clean oneself, a psychological reality known as the Macbeth effect. Our physical state provides information to our conscious mind. If we feel physically disgusted or dirty, our rider interprets that feeling as evidence that a moral violation has occurred. Psychopaths reason but don't feel. If reasoning were the true source of morality, then individuals possessing high intelligence and perfect logic should be moral exemplars. Yet the existence of psychopaths proves the exact opposite. Psychopaths are individuals who lack moral emotions. They do not experience compassion, guilt, shame, or remorse. However, their ability to reason remains entirely intact. Serial killers like Ted Bundy utilized brilliant, calculating logic to manipulate and trap their victims. Psychopathy is a genetic condition that creates a brain unmoved by the suffering of others. The rider is perfectly functional, capable of crafting elaborate strategies and justifications, but the elephant is completely unresponsive to the moral landscape. A reasoning mind devoid of moral intuition is not a philosopher. It is a predator. Babies feel but don't reason. Conversely, long before the capacity for language or conscious reasoning develops, infants demonstrate sophisticated moral intuitions. Psychologists have discovered that babies look longer at events that surprise them, revealing that their minds are not blank slates. In experiments using puppet shows, infants as young as 6 months watch a climber puppet trying to scale a hill. When a helper puppet assists the climber and a hinderer puppet repeatedly bashes the climber down, the infants subsequently show a strong, undeniable preference for reaching out and playing with the helper puppet. They possess an innate, unlearned capacity to evaluate the social interactions of others, developing a preference for kindness over cruelty long before they can articulate a single logical reason why. Effective reactions are in the right place at the right time in the brain. To definitively prove that intuition drives moral judgment, scientists have looked directly into the brain as it grapples with moral dilemmas. Joshua Green utilized fMRI scanners to observe subjects responding to variations of the classic trolley dilemma. When subjects were asked if they would physically push a man off a bridge to stop a train and save 5 lives, a scenario involving direct personal harm, the emotional processing centers of their brains lit up immediately. The strength of this emotional flash predicted whether they would reject the utilitarian math of trading one life for 5. However, when the scenario involved impersonal harm, simply flipping a switch to divert the train, the emotional alarm bells remained quiet, allowing the calculating, reasoning parts of the brain to take over and choose the mathematically optimal outcome. The brain's emotive centers fire first, delivering a clear mandate that reasoning merely attempts to translate into a logical defense. Elephants are sometimes open to reason. While the rider evolved to serve the elephant, this relationship is not one of a master and an absolute slave. It is more akin to a lawyer serving a powerful client. The lawyer usually does what the client demands, but occasionally the client can be persuaded to change course. We rarely change our own minds through isolated, private logic. Our elephants are primarily steered by social interaction. When we converse with someone we like or admire, our elephant leans toward them, making our rider genuinely open to finding the truth in their arguments. Even when alone, we can occasionally experience conflicting intuitions, much like staring at a Necker cube. A Necker cube is an optical illusion that your visual system can interpret in 2 conflicting ways, but never both simultaneously. Similarly, we can feel the pull of 2 competing moral intuitions, flipping back and forth between them. Furthermore, forcing a delay can alter the dynamic between the elephant and the rider. In experiments where subjects read a highly disturbing but objectively harmless story, like consensual adult incest, and were given a strong logical argument as to why it was permissible, their initial reaction was always condemnation. However, if the computer forced them to wait 2 full minutes before registering their judgment, the initial flash of emotional disgust faded. Given this enforced delay, the rider had time to actually evaluate the logical argument, and subjects became significantly more tolerant. Intuitions come first, but under the right conditions, usually involving time, affection, or a lack of immediate threat, the elephant will listen to reason. In sum, the landscape of the mind is fundamentally driven by rapid automatic evaluations. The brain evaluates its surroundings constantly, generating intuitive social and political judgments in a fraction of a second. These judgments are inextricably tethered to our physical bodies, shaped by physical sensations of disgust or cleanliness. When reasoning is severed from these affective feelings, the result is the terrifying logic of the psychopath. Yet, the emotional foundations of morality are present even in pre-verbal infants. The neurobiology of the brain confirms that emotional reactions occur at the exact right moment to drive our moral verdicts. The elephant rules, heavily influencing the rider's post hoc justifications, though it remains open to persuasion through friendly social influence or enforced reflection. This architecture begs a profound evolutionary question. As our hominid ancestors developed massive brains and language, why did natural selection give us an inner lawyer rather than an inner judge or scientist? The answer depends entirely on whether it was more important for our ancestors to discover objective truth or to fiercely guard their social reputations. Chapter 4. Vote for me. Here's why. Suppose the universe presented you with a choice on the day of your birth, decided by the flip of a coin. If the coin lands on heads, you will live a life of absolute fairness and unbreakable honesty, yet by some cosmic misunderstanding, everyone on Earth will view you as a despicable scoundrel. If the coin lands on tails, you will live entirely for your own selfish desires, lying and cheating whenever it benefits you. Yet the world will revere you as a paragon of unmatched virtue. Which fate would you genuinely prefer? This extreme hypothetical is the focal point of Plato's Republic, a foundational text of Western philosophy that argues extensively that one should choose heads. Plato insists that it is vastly superior to actually be virtuous than merely to seem virtuous. Early in the dialogue, Glaucon challenges Socrates to prove that justice is intrinsically rewarding. To make his point, Glaucon introduces the myth of the ring of Gyges, a magical gold band that grants its wearer absolute invisibility. Glaucon posits that no man, no matter how outwardly righteous, possesses the moral fortitude to remain on the path of justice if he could steal, murder, or satisfy his deepest lusts with total impunity. Glaucon argues that human beings are only virtuous because they live in terror of the consequences of being caught, and specifically the devastation of their social reputations. He demands that Socrates prove that a truly just man with a ruined reputation is somehow happier than a thoroughly corrupt man who is universally praised. Socrates attempts to meet this challenge by drawing an analogy between the human soul and the city-state. A just and happy city, he argues, is one of perfect harmony and rigid division of labor, where the rational philosophers rule over the turbulent masses. Consequently, a just and happy human being is one in which the divine, rational faculty absolute rules over the base, bodily passions. If reason sits on the throne, it cares only for what is objectively and eternally good, paying no mind to the superficial illusions of public reputation. Plato's profound faith in the perfectibility of human reason became the cornerstone of a philosophical tradition that elevates rationality to a sacred status. However, moral philosophy inevitably rests upon underlying assumptions about human psychology. In Plato's case, the assumed psychology is fundamentally flawed. Reason is simply not equipped to rule the mind. Its evolutionary design is oriented towards seeking justification, not objective truth. Glaucon was the one who accurately diagnosed human nature. People care immensely more about the appearance of virtue than the reality of it. The American psychologist William James urged a functionalist approach to the mind, recognizing that every mental mechanism must be understood by its utility within a larger system. Thinking, James observed, is for doing. The specific function of moral reasoning is not to guide us toward a transcendent moral truth, but to help us achieve socially strategic goals, such as guarding our reputations and persuading our peers to take our side in disputes. We are all intuitive politicians. When hundreds of insects cooperate flawlessly toward a shared goal, one can be certain they are genetic siblings, yet human beings routinely cooperate by the thousands, building skyscrapers, organizing societies, and marching into battle with individuals who share no direct kinship. We achieve this monumental feat of cooperation largely through the establishment of intricate webs of formal and informal accountability. We relentlessly hold others accountable for their actions, and we navigate our lives painfully aware that we are being held equally accountable by the community. Accountability is the expectation that one will be called upon to justify one's beliefs, feelings, or actions to others, paired with the reality that people will reward or punish us based on the quality of those justifications. When people operate outside of this web of accountability, society rapidly decays. Navigating this social reality requires us to act less like objective scientists seeking absolute truth, and more like intuitive politicians desperately striving to maintain an appealing moral identity before a variety of overlapping constituencies. While rationalists historically portrayed human beings as solitary philosophers running logical experiments to discover moral laws, the social world operates strictly on Glauconian terms. Experiments demonstrate that when people are left entirely to their own devices without the threat of observation, they succumb to a predictable array of cognitive laziness and selfish biases. When people know in advance that they will have to explain their decisions, they do think more systematically, but this careful thought takes two very different forms. Exploratory thought, the objective, even-handed consideration of all viewpoints, only occurs under highly specific conditions. The decision-maker must know they will be held accountable before forming an opinion. The audience's views must be entirely unknown, and the audience must prioritize absolute accuracy. Because these conditions almost never exist in daily life, accountability generally triggers confirmatory thought. This is a frantic, one-sided effort to rationalize a predetermined point of view. Decision-makers search for convincing reasons not only to placate their external audience, but to persuade themselves that their intuitive choice was genuinely the right one. Conscious reasoning serves the agenda of persuasion, not discovery. We are obsessed with polls. A legendary New York City mayor famously walked the streets asking his constituents, "How am I doing?" While few of us will ever run for public office, we are all unconsciously asking this exact question in nearly every social encounter. Psychologists have long documented the human need for self-esteem, but evolutionary logic dictates that an isolated internal need to think highly of oneself would offer no survival advantage to our ancestors. Survival in prehistoric times depended entirely on a person's ability to remain included and trusted by the group. Self-esteem is better understood as an internal sociometer, a gauge that continuously tracks our value as a relationship partner. Whenever this internal needle drops, it sounds an emotional alarm that compels us to alter our behavior to win back the group's favor. Some individuals proudly declare themselves mavericks, insisting they care nothing for the opinions of the herd. Yet, when these self-proclaimed nonconformists are brought into a laboratory and subjected to rigged experiments where they watch their approval ratings plummet in real time based on the supposed evaluations of hidden strangers, they experience immediate and undeniable drops in their self-worth. The sociometer operates entirely below the level of conscious awareness, relentlessly scanning the environment for any indication that our social value is in decline. The only individuals entirely unburdened by this obsession with public polling are psychopaths. Our in-house press secretary automatically justifies everything. The dynamic of the divided mind is perfectly mirrored by the relationship between a head of state and a press secretary. When a controversial policy is enacted, the press secretary does not pause to evaluate its objective merits or suggest revisions. Their sole duty is to stand before the public and weave a narrative that defends the policy at all costs. The conscious reasoning part of our mind, the rider, acts as the full-time in-house press secretary for the intuitive elephant. This phenomenon is vividly demonstrated by the confirmation bias, which is the deeply ingrained human tendency to seek out and interpret new information solely in ways that validate pre-existing beliefs. While people possess a remarkable capacity to critically dismantle the arguments of their opponents, they fiercely protect their own beliefs as if they were personal possessions. Even when evaluating objective, non-moral problems, such as deciphering numerical rules or determining which type of cake makes a child sick, people invariably form an immediate intuitive hunch and then selectively gather evidence to prove themselves right. One might hope that rigorous education and high intelligence serve to mitigate this bias, but research into everyday reasoning proves the opposite. When people of varying educational backgrounds and intelligence levels are asked to evaluate complex social issues, such as whether increased funding improves public schools, their intelligence does not predict a greater capacity for objective, exploratory thought. Higher intelligence simply allows a person to generate a substantially larger quantity of arguments supporting their own pre-existing side. Education does not train the mind to explore issues comprehensively. It merely provides the press secretary with a more sophisticated vocabulary to defend the elephant's intuitive leanings. We lie, cheat, and justify so well that we honestly believe we are honest. The myth of the Ring of Gyges is not merely an ancient fable. It plays out constantly in modern life. When a massive leak revealed that members of the British Parliament had been ruthlessly exploiting a poorly monitored expense system to renovate their private homes and enrich themselves at taxpayer expense, it proved Glaucon's thesis perfectly. Because their actions were hidden from the public eye, they behaved with astonishing avarice. Laboratory experiments on plausible deniability further expose our fractured morality. When an experimenter's assistant intentionally hands subjects too much money, only a small fraction of people will voluntarily point out the error and return the cash. However, if the assistant directly asks if the payment was correct, stripping away the subject's plausible deniability, the majority will return the funds rather than explicitly lie. Extensive research into cheating behavior reveals that when ordinary people are granted a cloak of invisibility, a scenario where they cannot be caught, they rarely cheat to the maximum possible extent. Instead, the vast majority of people cheat just a little bit. They calibrate their dishonesty to the exact threshold where their internal press secretary can still fabricate a plausible justification. This allows individuals to extract material benefits from cheating while flawlessly preserving their own internal self-concept as honest, upright citizens. Reasoning and Google can take you wherever you want to go. The profound influence of self-interest on reasoning can be mapped by the subtle psychological distinction between two questions. When confronted with a proposition we desperately want to believe, the mind asks, "Can I believe it?" The press secretary is immediately dispatched to scour the environment for a single piece of supporting evidence. Once that pseudo-evidence is located, the search is terminated, and we grant ourselves total permission to embrace the desired conclusion. Conversely, when confronted with a proposition that threatens our identity or desires, the mind asks, "Must I believe it?" In this defensive posture, we meticulously search for a single flaw, exception, or counter-argument. Finding just one excuse allows us to unlock the handcuffs of an unwanted truth and dismiss the claim entirely. This motivated reasoning is so powerful that it overrides objective scientific data, altering how individuals interpret medical diagnoses, evaluate intelligence tests, and even perceive raw visual stimuli. In the modern era, search engines have magnified this phenomenon, allowing anyone to bypass scientific consensus and instantly locate a community of dissenting voices that validates their desired reality. We can believe almost anything that supports our team. Decades of political science research have systematically dismantled the notion that human beings vote purely out of narrow economic self-interest. Rather than asking, "What is in it for me?" citizens predominantly ask, "What is in it for my group?" Political opinions serve as tribal badges of social membership. When neuroscientists place highly partisan voters into brain scanners and confront them with glaring contradictions and hypocrisies committed by their own political candidates, the logical processing centers of the brain remain strikingly quiet. Instead, a network of regions associated with negative emotion and threat flashes to life. The mind experiences intense distress until the internal press secretary manages to concoct a convoluted rationalization to excuse the candidate's behavior. Once the rationalization is achieved and the partisan escapes the cognitive threat, the brain's reward centers unleash a surge of dopamine. Extreme political partisanship operates precisely like a chemical addiction. The brain heavily reinforces the mental contortions required to remain perfectly aligned with one's chosen tribe. The rationalist delusion. The rationalist delusion is the persistent, romanticized belief that reasoning is our most noble and elevated attribute, a divine spark that fundamentally separates us from the beasts and serves as our singular pathway to moral truth. From Plato through the Enlightenment and into modern moral psychology, a great many thinkers have asserted that cultivating a superior ability to reason about ethical dilemmas directly causes an individual to behave more virtuously. If this delusion were grounded in reality, one would expect academic moral philosophers, individuals who dedicate their entire professional lives to the rigorous, logical analysis of ethical principles, to be the most virtuous members of society. Exhaustive behavioral studies, however, reveal that ethicists are no more likely to vote, donate blood, or give to charity than professors in any other discipline. Astoundingly, academic books on ethics are significantly more likely to be stolen from university libraries than other philosophical texts. Expertise in moral reasoning does not elevate moral behavior. It merely equips the rider with sharper rhetorical tools to justify the whims of the elephant. Reasoning did not evolve to guide us toward objective truth. It evolved to help us engage in interpersonal arguments, persuasion, and social manipulation. The confirmation bias is not a correctable glitch in the software of the mind. It is the core feature of an inherently argumentative cognitive system. We must cease expecting isolated individuals to engage in flawless, truth-seeking logic, particularly when their social identities are at stake. A single neuron is limited, but a vast network of interconnected neurons produces a brilliant brain. Similarly, human reasoning is functionally flawed at the individual level, but it can produce highly accurate and objective results when individuals are organized into ideologically diverse groups that are designed to rigorously challenge and disconfirm one another's press secretaries. In sum, the belief that moral reasoning operates as an objective, truth-seeking mechanism is a powerful illusion. Through the lens of functionalist psychology, it becomes evident that the mind is divided, and conscious reasoning serves almost exclusively as an internal press secretary, deploying its resources to defend the intuitive decisions already made by the emotional elephant. We are a species uniquely obsessed with our social standing, constantly monitoring our invisible approval ratings, while vehemently denying that we care what others think. This intense focus on reputation compels us to lie, cheat, and justify our transgressions so effectively that we remain entirely convinced of our own unwavering righteousness. When navigating the moral landscape, the mind approaches desirable information with a welcoming bias, while subjecting threatening information to impossible standards of skepticism. This motivated reasoning is heavily deployed in the service of our chosen groups, making political and ideological affiliations function as powerful, emotionally addictive tribal identities. The ancient fantasy that human beings can be educated into a state of pristine rationality, and that this rationality will guarantee ethical behavior, must be abandoned. If we wish to design a society that encourages genuine ethical conduct, we must stop appealing to the fictional, objective scientist within, and instead recognize the intuitive, reputation-obsessed politician that actually governs our behavior. Chapter 5. Beyond Weird Morality. Standing outside a fast food restaurant in West Philadelphia, asking working-class adults to share their thoughts on harmless taboo violations is an excellent way to confront one's own cultural isolation. When presented with scenarios meant to shock, a family eating its dead dog, a woman using a national flag as a rag, or a man having private sexual intercourse with a processed chicken, these individuals often responded with disbelieving stares. To them, the wrongness of these acts was so self-evident that the request for a justification seemed absurd. They were right to wonder about the perspective of their interviewer, who arrived from the insulated moral universe of an Ivy League university. The university students interviewed just blocks away were unique among all the demographic groups studied. They adhered with absolute consistency to a principle articulated by John Stuart Mill over a century ago. Power should only be exercised to prevent harm to others. As long as nobody was getting hurt, the university students were willing to ignore their own visceral disgust and declare even the most bizarre sexual or dietary acts morally permissible. This university population was unusual, belonging to a demographic recently categorized by cultural psychologists as weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. The psychological literature is overwhelmingly based on this small, extreme subset of the human population, individuals who are statistical outliers on nearly every measure of human nature. The defining characteristic of the weird mindset is a tendency to view the world as a collection of separate, autonomous objects, rather than a web of interconnected relationships. Where people in traditional societies conceive of themselves primarily in terms of their roles and duties to others, the weird mind sees the self as an independent entity defined by internal psychological traits. This analytical, object-focused style of thinking naturally generates moral systems that are highly individualistic, rule-based, and universalist. If the world is perceived as a gathering of isolated individuals, the paramount moral concerns must necessarily be about protecting those individuals from harm and ensuring absolute fairness. However, in non-weird societies where holistic thinking dominates and people perceive contexts, groups, and institutions as the primary reality, a sociocentric morality emerges. Here, the needs of the collective supersede the desires of the individual, requiring an entirely different set of moral concepts to bind the society together. To understand this broader moral landscape, it is necessary to recognize that multiple ethical frameworks exist simultaneously, capturing a far more descriptive picture of human morality than a single focus on harm. Cultural psychology suggests that human minds and cultures continuously shape each other. By examining diverse cultures, researchers have identified 3 distinct clusters of moral themes: the ethics of autonomy, community, and divinity. The ethic of autonomy is the familiar moral language of the individualistic West, based on the premise that people are autonomous actors whose wants and preferences should be protected by concepts of rights, liberty, and justice. But beyond the secular West, the ethic of community speaks to the reality that people are first and foremost members of larger entities, families, tribes, and nations. These entities possess a reality and importance that demands protection through concepts like duty, hierarchy, respect, and patriotism. In this light, the relentless pursuit of individual goals appears dangerous, threatening to unravel the social fabric. Furthermore, the ethic of divinity operates on the premise that individuals are temporary vessels containing a divine spark. The body is regarded as a temple, not a playground. Consequently, moral concepts such as sanctity, purity, and pollution emerge to prevent degradation and honor the sacred order of the universe, rendering the personal liberties celebrated in the West as little more than libertinism. Immersing oneself in a culture governed by these broader ethics can fundamentally alter one's perspective, transforming a rigid absolutist into a pluralist. Traveling to a traditional, sociocentric society such as the deeply religious and hierarchical city of Bhubaneswar in India can initially induce profound dissonance in a mind conditioned by liberal, secular individualism. Yet, through the simple act of experiencing the hospitality and warmth of the people there, empathy begins to override ideological rigidities. Rather than viewing a sex-segregated and hierarchical society merely through the lens of oppression, one begins to recognize a moral world where the extended family is the basic unit of society, and where honoring elders, protecting subordinates, and fulfilling duties take precedence over the pursuit of equality and personal autonomy. Standing within the ethic of community, the hyper-individualism of the West suddenly appears isolating and self-centered. Similarly, the ethic of divinity transitions from a purely academic concept into a deeply felt reality when surrounded by a culture that meticulously maintains spiritual topographies. When the boundaries between the clean and the dirty dictate daily movements, such as removing shoes before entering a home or recognizing the heightened purity of an inner temple sanctum, the universe is no longer perceived as a collection of dead matter. It becomes infused with order, where objects, texts, and bodies must be treated with reverence. This perspective sheds light on the fierce cultural battles over sacrilege back in the West, where the desecration of a national flag or a religious icon is not merely an offense against taste, but a pollution of the world. The ethic of divinity provides the vocabulary to articulate feelings of elevation and degradation, offering a crucial framework for critiquing the spiritual emptiness and crass consumerism that often accompany a society entirely devoted to the satisfaction of personal desires. Experiencing these diverse moral worlds is akin to stepping out of a consensual hallucination, an awakening that reveals how multiple moral matrices coexist. Each matrix weaves a complete, emotionally compelling worldview that feels self-evidently true to its inhabitants and impregnable to outside arguments. A person raised in a liberal environment naturally views the world as a heroic narrative of liberation, where progress involves dismantling oppressive hierarchies and traditions to free victims. From within this specific matrix, alternative political visions, such as conservatism, seem incomprehensible, easily dismissed as the product of pure self-interest or hidden bigotry. But once the boundaries of this matrix are breached, the moral logic of the opposition becomes clear. The conservative emphasis on traditional structures, the regulation of desires, and the preservation of institutional integrity aligns seamlessly with the ethics of community and divinity. Human beings are multiple from the start, equipped with a vast array of latent moral intuitions. A weird upbringing cultivates a hypersensitivity to oppression and inequality, while a more traditional upbringing hones the ability to detect disrespect and degradation. The second foundational principle of moral psychology asserts that there is far more to morality than harm and fairness. Research confirms that individuals from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies are extreme statistical outliers who perceive a world of isolated objects rather than interconnected relationships. Consequently, their moral domain is unusually narrow, confined almost entirely to the ethic of autonomy. Across the vast sweep of human cultures and within conservative enclaves of Western societies, moral pluralism is the reality. The moral domain broadly encompasses the ethics of community and divinity, utilizing a wider array of moral foundations. Because these moral matrices bind people together into tight-knit communities, they simultaneously blind them to the coherence and validity of alternative moral worlds, making it a profound challenge to recognize that there is more than one valid framework for running a society and living a good life. Chapter 6. Taste Buds of the Righteous Mind. Imagine wandering into a highly acclaimed restaurant, sitting down with great anticipation and discovering that the kitchen serves only a single flavor. No matter what you order, be it a soup, a primary course, or a dessert, every dish is engineered to deliver nothing but maximum sweetness. To a diverse, sophisticated human palate, such a dining experience would be initially confusing, rapidly sickening, and ultimately absurd. Yet, this is precisely the menu that the most prominent Western moral philosophers have attempted to force upon humanity for the past 2 centuries. To understand the true depth and complexity of human morality, we must fundamentally shift our perspective. The righteous mind is not a mathematical calculator or a flawless logic puzzle. It is much more like a tongue. We possess a variety of distinct moral taste receptors, and any worldview that attempts to reduce our complex moral palate to a single sensation is destined to misunderstand human nature. The birth of moral science occurred during the vibrant intellectual awakening of the Scottish Enlightenment. In the 18th century, philosophers like David Hume and Adam Smith correctly identified that morality was not a matter of cold, divine deduction, but of profound human feeling. They argued that our moral judgments are rooted in sentiments. Just as the tongue automatically experiences pleasure upon encountering sweetness or revulsion upon tasting bitterness, the human mind instinctively perceives the beauty of an act of kindness or the profound ugliness of a betrayal. For these early empiricists, morality was an observable phenomenon, deeply woven into the fabric of human interaction. They recognized that while culture and upbringing refine our tastes, the fundamental receptors are innate. Morality, they understood, is a sensory experience, an organic part of the human animal's repertoire for navigating the social world. This promising, reality-based approach was abruptly derailed by the attack of the systemizers. In the cognitive sciences, researchers draw a critical distinction between two distinct ways of processing the world: empathizing and systemizing. Empathizing is the intuitive drive to identify another person's emotions and respond with appropriate sentiment. Systemizing, conversely, is the analytical drive to break down a complex system into its individual variables, isolate the underlying rules, and predict or control the outcome. The great tragedy of Western moral philosophy is that it was hijacked by brilliant but extreme systemizers. Individuals who were intensely highly functioning in analytical logic, but perhaps disconnected from the messy, emotional realities of human social life, began to dominate the intellectual landscape. They looked at the pluralistic, emotionally rich moral theories of Hume and Smith and saw only chaotic inconsistency. Their goal was to strip away the complex sentiments and reduce the entirety of human morality to a single, elegant, logically unassailable principle. The first prominent attempt to reduce morality to a single metric was championed by Jeremy Bentham and the utilitarian Grill. Bentham, writing in the late 18th century, was a classic systemizer who famously declared that mankind is governed by two absolute masters, pain and pleasure. He constructed a moral philosophy known as utilitarianism, which operates on one simple mathematical rule: an action is morally correct if it maximizes the overall utility, defined as total pleasure, and minimizes total pain for the greatest number of people. If we return to our restaurant metaphor, Bentham essentially built a kitchen that completely ignores the existence of salt, sour, bitter, and umami. It serves only sweetness. Utilitarianism is an exceptionally powerful tool for designing public policy or running an economy, but as a complete description of human morality, it is glaringly deficient. It requires its adherents to ignore profound intuitions about justice, rights, and loyalty, insisting that the sacrifice of an innocent person is perfectly moral if it somehow brings a mathematically larger quantity of pleasure to a crowd. The second monumental reduction came from Immanuel Kant and the deontological diner. Kant was deeply repulsed by the utilitarian suggestion that morality was merely a calculation of physical pleasures and pains. He sought a foundation for ethics that was entirely divorced from the fickle nature of human desires or the unpredictable consequences of our actions. Kant built his system on pure, unadulterated reason and the concept of absolute duty, a school of thought known as deontology. His crowning achievement was the categorical imperative, a rule stating that one must act only according to a maxim that could simultaneously be willed as a universal law for all of humanity. In the dining metaphor, Kant's restaurant does not care about the flavor of the food at all. The only thing that matters is the pristine logic of the kitchen's procedures and the absolute guarantee that every waiter follows the exact same universal rules of service, regardless of whether the patrons actually enjoy the meal. Kantian logic demands that if a murderer comes to your door asking for the location of his next victim, you must tell the absolute truth, because lying violates a universal logical rule. It strips morality of its empathy, its context, and its humanity, leaving behind a cold, sterile architecture of unbreakable rules. To correct these historical missteps and return to a comprehensive understanding of human nature, it is necessary to establish a moral foundations theory. Working closely with the anthropologist Craig Joseph, the objective was to review the vast and incredibly diverse anthropological literature describing how different cultures construct their moral universes, and to synthesize these observations with the latest findings in evolutionary psychology. The developmental psychologist Gary Marcus provides a crucial insight here. Nature does not provide a finished blueprint for the mind. Rather, nature provides a first draft, which experience then continually revises. The human mind is not a blank slate, nor is it hardwired with rigid rules. Instead, it is equipped with a specific set of innate cognitive modules. The cognitive scientist Dan Sperber explains that an evolutionary module is like a specific switch in the brain, designed by natural selection to respond to a specific survival challenge in our ancestral environment. This original evolutionary trigger, such as the sight of a suffering child, activated a module that produced an immediate emotion, ensuring the survival of our kin. However, in the modern world, these ancient modules can be activated by a vast array of current triggers. For example, a heartwarming advertisement featuring a completely unrelated child or even a cartoon animal can hijack the exact same emotional switch. By mapping the recurring moral themes found across all human cultures, from the hunter-gatherers of the Amazon to the urbanites of modern metropolises, it becomes possible to identify the original first draft of the righteous mind. Just as all humans are born with the same 5 taste receptors on their physical tongues, yet construct an infinite variety of local cuisines based on history and available ingredients, all humans are born with the same innate moral receptors. Western liberal philosophy, by focusing exclusively on harm and fairness, successfully mapped only a fraction of the tongue. To understand why good people are divided by politics and religion, we must map the entire moral palette, identifying the complete set of foundational sensitivities that societies utilize to build their unique moral cuisines. Chapter 7. The Moral Foundations of Politics. Behind every act of altruism, heroism, and human decency, one will invariably find either hidden selfishness or sheer stupidity. That, at least, is the cynical view long held by many social scientists who embrace the concept that Homo sapiens is fundamentally Homo economicus. This economic man is a simple, calculating creature who navigates all of life's choices much like a shopper in a supermarket, meticulously weighing costs and benefits to maximize personal utility. If this were a true portrait of human nature, constructing mathematical models of our behavior would be a trivial task, because only one principle would be at work: narrow self-interest. To expose the profound inadequacy of this view, one need only ask people to assign a monetary price to a series of actions. Homo economicus would put a specific price tag on sticking a needle into his own arm, but he would demand little to no compensation for actions that inflict no physical or financial harm, such as secretly criticizing his own nation to a foreigner, slapping his father in the face as part of a comedy skit, or engaging in a harmless but degrading sexual taboo. Yet, the vast majority of human beings find these latter actions intensely aversive, often refusing to perform them for any amount of money. If you recoil at the thought of violating loyalty, authority, or sanctity, then you are a human being, not an economist's fantasy. You possess a complex working set of moral foundations. To grasp the nature of these foundations, it is necessary to confront the concept of innateness. Historically, it was professionally hazardous for a scientist to assert that anything about human behavior was innate. The prevailing academic climate demanded proof that an innate trait was rigidly hardwired, entirely immune to life experience, and identically manifested in every culture on Earth. Under such an impossibly strict definition, little beyond the grasping reflex of an infant qualifies as innate. However, modern neuroscience provides a far more sophisticated framework. The brain is not an immutable circuit board. It is better understood as a book whose first draft is written by our genes during fetal development. No chapter, whether it concerns sexuality, food preferences, or morality, is complete at birth. But crucially, neither do these chapters consist of blank pages waiting for society to author every word. Innateness means that the mind is organized in advance of experience. Nature provides the rough evolutionary draft, which cultural experience then edits and revises. The righteous mind is built upon a specific, pre-wired draft, which gives rise to the diverse moralities observed across different cultures and political ideologies. The first chapter of this draft is the care-harm foundation. The evolutionary story begins with the divergence of mammals from reptiles. When the earliest mammals began nursing their young, they drastically altered the mathematics of reproduction. Instead of producing dozens of offspring and leaving them to the mercies of chance, mammals began making fewer evolutionary bets and investing massive resources into each one. For human beings, this investment is extreme. Because our brains are so extraordinarily large, human infants must be born essentially premature, requiring years of intense, constant nurturing just to survive. This created a monumental adaptive challenge, the imperative to keep the vulnerable and expensive child alive. It is inconceivable that the mechanism for mothering is entirely learned through trial and error. Evolution ruthlessly favored those who possessed an automatic visceral sensitivity to the signs of suffering and distress in children. The original trigger of this module was the suffering of one's own kin, but the current triggers have expanded tremendously. The human mind is now intuitively responsive to the physical proportions of cuteness, prompting an urge to protect and nurture even unrelated children, baby animals, or cartoon characters. In the modern political arena, the Care Foundation is aggressively targeted. When you see a bumper sticker pleading to save Darfur, you are witnessing the political left utilizing the Care Foundation, attempting to stretch our innate compassion to encompass distant, unrelated victims. The political right also relies heavily on this foundation, but tends to blend it with loyalty, directing its protective compassion toward those who have sacrificed for the local group, such as wounded military veterans. The second chapter of the draft is the Fairness Cheating Foundation. If a colleague unexpectedly offers to cover your arduous shifts for a week so you can enjoy a vacation, your reaction is not the cold, calculating pleasure of an economic machine receiving a free asset. You feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude, accompanied by an intense psychological pressure to return the favor in the future. While altruism toward close relatives is easily explained by shared genetics, cooperation among non-kin was long an evolutionary puzzle. The solution is reciprocal altruism. Human life is a continuous series of opportunities for mutually beneficial cooperation, from hunting large game to covering a co-worker's shift. For millions of years, our ancestors faced the adaptive challenge of reaping these collaborative benefits without being exploited by parasites and slackers. Evolution favored those equipped with moral emotions that compelled them to play a strategy of tit for tat, to be cooperative initially, but to strictly reserve future cooperation for those who proved reliable. The original triggers of the Fairness module are acts of cooperation or selfishness exhibited by others. We experience deep satisfaction when people prove trustworthy and intense anger or contempt when they attempt to cheat us. Today, everyone values fairness, but it is bifurcated by politics. On the left, fairness is often interpreted as equality and social justice. It is the outrage that the wealthy are exploiting the vulnerable and not paying their fair share. On the right, fairness is fiercely defined as proportionality. Individuals must be rewarded in strict proportion to their hard work, and taking resources from the industrious to subsidize those perceived as lazy is viewed as a profound moral violation. The third chapter is the Loyalty Betrayal Foundation. In a legendary sociological experiment, researchers brought a group of ordinary 12-year-old boys to a summer camp at Robbers Cave State Park. They were divided into two groups and kept entirely separate. Almost immediately, without any adult instruction, the boys began marking territory, developing strict group norms, and forging intense tribal identities. When the researchers finally allowed the two groups to compete in a baseball tournament, the latent tribalism erupted into vicious warfare. They desecrated each other's handmade flags, raided bunks, and crafted crude weapons. This behavior is not merely the cruelty of youth, it is the manifestation of an ancient survival mechanism. Human beings are the descendants of successful tribalists. For millions of years, our ancestors faced the brutal adaptive challenge of forming cohesive coalitions capable of fending off rival groups. The male mind, in particular, appears innately structured to find deep satisfaction in the rituals and loyalties that generate group cohesion. The original trigger for this foundation is any cue that distinguishes a dedicated team player from a traitor. while modern society safely channels this tribal instinct into the fanaticism of sports. Its purest expressions remain in warfare and religion. To the loyalist, an enemy is an expected threat, but a traitor, or an apostate who abandons the faith, is the ultimate abomination, deserving of the deepest circle of hell. In politics, the right intuitively harnesses this foundation through appeals to patriotism, military honor, and national unity. The left, structurally inclined toward universalism and a suspicion of exclusionary nationalism, often struggles to communicate in the language of loyalty, occasionally making itself vulnerable to accusations of treachery. The fourth chapter is the authority subversion foundation. In many cultures, the concept of respecting one's elders and superiors is so fundamental that it is hardwired into the grammar of the language itself. While modern egalitarian societies often conflate all authority with oppressive power and exploitation, this is a profound misunderstanding of human history. The evolution of authority can be traced back to the dominance hierarchies of other primates, but in human civilizations, authority is not merely raw, coercive force. Legitimate human authority figures, from ancient kings to modern parents, historically assumed a pastoral responsibility to maintain order, resolve disputes, and protect the weak. Subordinates offer deference and respect. Superiors offer protection and guidance. The adaptive challenge was to navigate these hierarchies successfully, forging relationships that provided stability and shielded individuals from chaos. The original triggers of this foundation are patterns of behavior indicating respect, submission, or rebellion. When people witness an act that actively subverts a legitimate authority or a stabilizing tradition, they feel an immediate, intuitive flash of disapproval, even if no one was directly harmed. The political right inherently grasps the importance of this foundation, viewing the preservation of strong families, institutions, and traditional values as the essential bulwark against societal decay. The left, defining itself heavily by its opposition to hierarchy and its desire to liberate the oppressed, frequently views the authority foundation with deep suspicion. The fifth chapter is the sanctity-degradation foundation. Consider the horrific but factual case of an engineer who answered an online advertisement seeking a man willing to be slaughtered and consumed. The two men met, recorded a video proving absolute, uncoerced consent, and proceeded with an act of mutilation, murder, and cannibalism. If your moral universe is restricted exclusively to the principle of autonomy and the avoidance of non-consensual harm, you are rendered morally speechless by this event. No one was forced, no third party was injured, yet the overwhelming majority of humanity feels a crushing sense of disgust and a conviction that an absolute moral law has been violated. This reaction is the essence of the sanctity foundation. Its origins lie in the omnivore's dilemma. Because our ancestors consumed a wide variety of foods, they were in constant danger of ingesting toxins and parasites. We evolved a behavioral immune system, the emotion of disgust, which originally triggered in response to sights and smells that predicted disease, such as corpses or excrement. Over time, this powerful biological mechanism expanded to govern the social and spiritual realms. We intuitively feel that the human body is not merely a machine or a slab of meat. It is a vessel containing a sacred spark. This foundation provides the psychological architecture necessary to view objects, flags, places, and principles as sacred, defending them furiously against desecration. The political right utilizes this foundation constantly in its defense of the sanctity of life and marriage, viewing the body as a temple to be kept pure. The left, while often mocking conservative purity rules as prudishness, relies heavily on the sanctity foundation to animate the environmental movement, viewing corporate pollution as a profane degradation of sacred nature. In sum, the moral domain is vastly larger than the narrow confines of harm and fairness. By tracing our evolutionary history, we can identify a universal first draft of the righteous mind, equipped with at least 5 foundational taste receptors: care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. The political left has constructed a moral matrix that relies almost entirely on care and fairness, creating a vision focused fiercely on protecting victims and dismantling inequality. The political right, however, builds its moral matrix upon all 5 foundations. By honoring loyalty, respecting authority, and defending the sacred, conservative politicians possess a broader moral palette. granting them a distinct structural advantage in appealing to the full spectrum of human moral intuition. Chapter 8. The Conservative Advantage. Following the 2004 presidential election, a distinct pattern became evident to anyone willing to look at the psychological mechanics of American politics. The political right fundamentally understands human moral psychology in a way that the political left does not. When addressing a gathering of local Democrats shortly after John Kerry's defeat, it was necessary to deliver a harsh truth. Democratic messaging often fails because it speaks almost exclusively to the rider, emphasizing rational policy benefits while entirely missing the elephant. Republican messaging, by contrast, goes straight for the gut. By tracing the success of Republican campaigns from the era of Richard Nixon through George W. Bush, one sees a deliberate and masterful triggering of a wide array of moral intuitions. While Democrats reliably appeal to the care and fairness foundations, focusing on victims and demanding equality, Republicans tap into a much broader moral palette. They invoke loyalty through patriotism and military honor, authority through respect for traditions and elders, and sanctity through Christian family values. The left offers a moral meal consisting only of sugar and salt, while the right offers a 5-course feast. Measuring morals. To move this observation from speculation to science, it was necessary to quantify these moral differences. Working with graduate student Jesse Graham, the Moral Foundations Questionnaire, MFQ, was developed to measure how much weight people assigned to various moral concerns. The results, gathered initially from thousands of online participants, produced a striking and undeniable visual pattern. For those identifying as very liberal, the graph showed a massive spike in the relevance of the care and fairness foundations, accompanied by a steep drop-off for loyalty, authority, and sanctity. Liberals essentially operate on a two-foundation morality. However, as the data moved rightward across the political spectrum, the lines converged. For those identifying as very conservative, all 5 foundations were endorsed more or less equally. Conservatives literally possess a broader moral matrix. This pattern proved robust across different methodologies. Whether analyzing the specific traits people desired in a pet dog, liberals wanted gentle and egalitarian pets, while conservatives wanted loyal and obedient ones, parsing the vocabulary used in Unitarian versus Southern Baptist sermons, or measuring the instantaneous brainwave reactions of partisans reading morally loaded sentences, the conclusion remained the same. The conservative advantage lies in a structural capacity to appeal to a wider spectrum of innate human moral intuitions. What makes people vote Republican? Psychologists have historically attempted to explain conservatism away as a pathology, a product of strict parenting, a fear of novelty, or an inability to handle complexity. This allowed liberals to dismiss conservative ideas without engaging them. A better approach is to assume conservative sincerity and analyze their moral matrix. The fundamental divide between left and right can be understood as a clash between two sociological visions. The liberal vision, championed by John Stuart Mill, views society as a contractual arrangement among autonomous individuals who should be left free to pursue their own happiness, provided they do not harm others. This vision relies entirely on care and fairness. The conservative vision, echoing the sociologist Emile Durkheim, views society as an organic entity that must be protected from decay. Individuals are born into constraining, hierarchical relationships that limit their autonomy but provide stability and meaning. A Durkheimian society values self-control, duty and loyalty over absolute self-expression. It recognizes that moral communities are fragile and require the binding foundations, loyalty, authority, and sanctity, to survive. When the political left sacralizes diversity and universalism over national unity and tradition, it naturally alienates those whose moral matrices are tuned to these binding foundations. What I had missed. Publishing these observations drew intense reactions from both sides of the political divide. While many conservatives agreed with the assessment of their Durkheimian worldview, economic conservatives offered a fierce and highly instructive pushback. They argued that the analysis fundamentally misunderstood their conception of fairness. For the left, fairness is almost entirely synonymous with equality, equal rights, and increasingly equal outcomes. For the economic right, however, fairness means proportionality. It is the law of karma. It is the Protestant work ethic. People should reap exactly what they sow. Taking money from hard-working individuals to subsidize those perceived as lazy or irresponsible is viewed as a profound moral violation. This realization necessitated a revision of the theory. The Fairness Foundation had to be expanded to properly account for proportionality, and the intense desire for equality had to be separated out into a newly recognized sixth foundation: the Liberty Oppression Foundation. To understand the origins of the drive for equality, one must examine the evolutionary history of hunter-gatherer societies. While humans are primates innately predisposed to hierarchical dominance, our ancestors underwent a profound political transition. The anthropologist Christopher Boehm notes that the invention of weapons, combined with the power of language and gossip, allowed early humans to form reverse dominance hierarchies. Subordinates could now band together to shame, ostracize, or even kill any would-be alpha male who attempted to bully or dominate the group. This evolutionary pressure selected for individuals who were acutely sensitive to signs of tyranny and capable of experiencing righteous, group-unifying anger to resist it. This is the Liberty Oppression Foundation. It operates in tension with the Authority Foundation, making us universally wary of illegitimate power. Both the political left and right rely heavily on this foundation, but they direct their hatred of oppression at different targets. The left directs it primarily toward the defense of marginalized groups and victims, fighting against systemic inequality and corporate dominance. The right directs it parochially toward the defense of their own groups and liberties, fighting against the tyranny of a bloated, overtaxing government and restrictive regulations. Fairness as proportionality. The emergence of the Tea Party movement provided a perfect, real-world demonstration of the tension between these competing moral visions. When commentators on the left mocked the populist outrage over government bailouts for struggling homeowners, they assumed the anger was born of pure selfishness or cruelty. They failed to recognize the activation of the Fairness Foundation in its purest proportional form. To the conservative mind, a government that uses taxpayer money to subsidize the bad bets of irresponsible borrowers is actively promoting bad behavior. It is punishing the prudent to reward the reckless. This violates the deep-seated evolutionary logic of reciprocal altruism. Fairness as proportionality is a powerful moral force, and any political movement that appears to violate it will inevitably trigger a massive, righteous backlash. Chapter 9. Why are we so groupish? In the days immediately following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, a powerful, primitive urge emerged: the desire to display the national flag. It was as though a dormant alarm had been tripped, a psychological mechanism commanding a sudden, overwhelming display of allegiance. People rushed to donate blood, give to charities, and support their fellow citizens, eager to demonstrate their membership in a unified collective. Yet for an academic steeped in cosmopolitan universalist values, the sudden surge of patriotism felt uncomfortable. The eventual compromise, displaying both an American flag and a United Nations flag side by side, was an attempt to honor this deep tribal pull without abandoning an intellectual commitment to global egalitarianism. This experience highlights a profound tension in human nature. Much of moral psychology can be explained through the lens of enlightened self-interest, where humans are viewed essentially as primates driven by individualistic competition. This framework suggests that our moral instincts are primarily strategic, designed to manage reputations and outmaneuver peers in the evolutionary game. However, this cynical portrait fails to capture the entirety of the human experience. Humans are also profoundly groupish. We enthusiastically bind ourselves into teams, organizations, and ideological camps, often cooperating with strangers toward shared objectives with an intensity that suggests our minds were explicitly engineered for teamwork. To fully comprehend morality, politics, and religion, we must recognize that human nature is dual. It is fundamentally selfish, but it is heavily overlaid with a groupish mechanism. We are, in essence, primates who possess a latent, hive-like capacity. This realization resurrects a controversial concept in evolutionary biology: group selection. Did our groupish tendencies evolve simply because cooperative individuals outcompeted selfish individuals within the same group? Or did they evolve because cohesive groups systematically outcompeted fractured groups? The latter process, group selection, was famously banished from mainstream science in the latter half of the 20th century. Yet, a closer examination of human evolution demands its exoneration. Victorious tribes. Charles Darwin himself recognized the logic of group selection. He observed that a tribe composed of courageous, loyal, and sympathetic members who were willing to aid and defend one another would inevitably conquer a tribe of selfish and contentious individuals. In this scenario, natural selection operates on the group as a whole. However, Darwin also identified the primary obstacle to this theory, the free rider problem. Within that victorious, courageous tribe, the individuals who shirked their duties and avoided the front lines of battle would be the most likely to survive and reproduce. How could self-sacrificing virtues ever proliferate if the selfish members consistently leave behind more offspring? This dilemma is the core of multi-level selection theory. Life exists in nested hierarchies, genes within cells, cells within organisms, organisms within groups. Competition occurs at every level. While groups of cooperators defeat groups of selfish individuals simultaneously defeat cooperators within any given group. For traits like extreme altruism to evolve, the pressures of group-level selection must somehow overwhelm the pressures of individual-level selection, a phenomenon clearly visible in highly social insects like bees, where internal competition is almost entirely suppressed. Darwin proposed that early humans solved the free rider problem through several mechanisms, most notably our intense sensitivity to praise and blame. Because our ancestors were obsessed with their reputations, the social costs of cowardice or betrayal became devastating. Furthermore, the human capacity to treat certain duties as sacred ensured that those who violated the group's trust were heavily punished or ostracized. When a group successfully suppresses internal selfishness, the dynamics of evolution shift. Group-level selection becomes a dominant force, allowing genes that promote loyalty and tribal cohesion to spread, ultimately forging a moral sense. A vast herd of deer? Despite Darwin's insights, the concept of group selection fell into disrepute, largely due to the rigorous critiques of biologists in the 1960s. The prevailing argument was that adaptations must be understood at the lowest possible level of selection. For instance, a herd of deer might move together rapidly to escape a predator, but this does not mean the herd evolved as a single entity to be fast. Rather, the individual deer that were too slow were eaten, leaving only the fastest to reproduce. A fast herd is merely a collection of fast individuals, shaped entirely by individual-level selection. For group selection to be scientifically valid, one must find adaptations that exist solely for the benefit of the group, not the individual, because nearly all animal behavior could be mathematically explained by individual selfishness or kin selection, where animals help close relatives to propagate shared genes. Biologists concluded that true group-related adaptations simply do not exist. This intellectual shift ushered in an era where all human behavior, no matter how seemingly altruistic, was analyzed as a covert form of self-interest. Acts of genuine charity towards strangers were dismissed as evolutionary misfirings, ancient psychological circuits accidentally triggered in the modern, anonymous world. Yet, this absolute rejection of group selection ignores the unique reality of human organization. If human beings universally and spontaneously form cooperative groups with complex divisions of labor, this is a prime candidate for a group-related adaptation. The spontaneous, massive cooperation seen in the aftermath of national tragedies cannot be fully explained by selfish genes misfiring. Exhibit A. Major transitions in evolution. The history of life on Earth is defined by rare but monumental shifts known as major transitions. These occur when individual, competing units find a way to suppress their conflicts and merge into a higher-level superorganism. The fusion of separate bacteria into a single eukaryotic cell, or the clustering of single cells into a multicellular organism, are profound examples of multi-level selection. In each transition, once free riding is eliminated, the newly formed cooperative entity possesses a massive evolutionary advantage. This process is not limited to biology, it applies to social structures as well. Millions of years ago, certain insects developed the ability to divide labor and defend a shared nest, transitioning into the eusocial superorganisms we recognize as ant colonies and beehives. These colonial insects, despite representing a tiny fraction of species, rapidly dominated ecosystems because of their unparalleled cooperative efficiency. Human beings underwent a remarkably similar transition. Our ancestors were territorial primates who required defensible nests and extensive resources to raise highly dependent offspring while fending off rival bands. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these pressures pushed early humans across the threshold of ultra-sociality. We are the only primate to make this transition, effectively becoming the architects of our own intricate, rule-bound hives. Exhibit B, shared intentionality. The evolutionary Rubicon that separated human cognition from that of other primates was not merely the development of language, but the emergence of shared intentionality. While chimpanzees are extraordinarily intelligent, their cognition is fundamentally individualistic. They cannot seamlessly share a mental representation of a collaborative task. A chimpanzee might hunt alongside others, but it is a simultaneous individual effort rather than a true cooperative strategy. In contrast, human toddlers naturally grasp the concept of joint attention and shared goals. At some point in our evolutionary history, early humans developed the capacity to look at a problem, understand that a partner was looking at the same problem, and work together with a shared mental model of the solution. This breakthrough allowed for true division of labor and the establishment of shared expectations. When an entire group shares expectations about how things ought to be done and experiences collective outrage when those expectations are violated, a moral matrix is born. This shared intentionality is the invisible architecture upon which all human institutions, norms, and moral communities are built. Exhibit C, genes and cultures co-evolve. The timeline of human evolution reveals that the transition to cooperative societies transformed the evolutionary process itself. As our ancestors began to accumulate cultural innovations, from sophisticated tools to cooking techniques, these cultural environments created new selection pressures that altered our genetic trajectory. This is the process of gene-culture coevolution. One of the most crucial cultural innovations was the use of symbolic markers, body paint, clothing, or rituals, to identify members of a specific tribe. Groups that utilized these markers could extend trust and cooperation beyond immediate kin, forging larger, more formidable coalitions. In these prototribal environments, individuals who could not control their aggressive impulses or conform to the group's norms were ostracized, denied mates, or killed. Over generations, this resulted in a process of self-domestication. Just as wolves were selectively bred into docile dogs, early humans inadvertently bred themselves for sociability, compliance, and an innate capacity for shame and guilt. Our righteous minds are an evolutionary overlay, a set of tribal instincts layered upon our older primate selfishness. Exhibit D, evolution can be fast. A lingering objection to this evolutionary narrative is the assumption that biological change occurs too slowly to account for the complex moral structures that arose during the relatively brief span of human civilization. However, recent genomic research has shattered the belief that human evolution halted tens of thousands of years ago. In reality, the rate of genetic change accelerated exponentially during the Holocene era as expanding populations encountered new climates, diets, and social structures. When cultural environments shift dramatically, such as the transition from nomadic foraging to settled agriculture, the virtues that lead to success also change. A society that relies on cooperative farming or disciplined military defense will exert intense selection pressures on its members. Under periods of extreme environmental stress or intense intergroup conflict, the genetic traits that facilitate group cohesion and survival can spread through a population in a matter of centuries, not millions of years. It's not all about war. It is crucial to recognize that group selection does not exclusively equate to warfare or violence. The competition between groups is fundamentally about efficiency. The group that can best extract resources from its environment and transform them into surviving offspring will prevail. While this cohesion can certainly be deployed in brutal intertribal conflicts, the underlying psychological mechanisms are essentially cooperative. Groupishness is defined by the ability to suppress antisocial behavior, share resources, and sacrifice for the collective good. It is an instinct that promotes internal harmony, even if it can be mobilized against outsiders. In sum, human nature is a complex duality. We are driven by the individualistic, strategic calculations of a primate, yet we possess a profound evolutionary capacity for selflessness and group devotion, much like a bee in a hive. The long-standing dismissal of group selection ignored the reality of major evolutionary transitions, the unique human capacity for shared intentionality, the powerful engine of gene-culture coevolution, and the rapid pace at which natural selection can operate in changing cultural environments. We are the descendants of those who learned to suppress their individual selfishness to become part of a victorious collective. This groupish overlay is the foundation of our moral communities, binding us together with shared sacred values while simultaneously blinding us to the moral truths of competing tribes. Chapter 10. The Hive Switch. In her exploration of ecstatic rituals and collective joy, the author Barbara Ehrenreich observed a profound historical shift. For most of human history, people regularly engaged in festivals, dances, and rituals that allowed them to lose themselves in the overwhelming emotion of a group. Yet the modern Western world has increasingly marginalized these experiences, viewing the loss of individual consciousness with deep suspicion, often pathologizing it as a form of hysteria or mob mentality. We are conditioned to view ourselves as isolated, autonomous actors, navigating a world of other isolated actors. The sociologist Emil Durkheim, however, understood that this individualistic view represents only half of the human equation. Durkheim argued that human beings exist as homo duplex, creatures who live primarily in the ordinary, profane realm of individual desires and petty self-interests, but who possess an extraordinary capacity to step into a sacred realm. In this sacred realm, the boundaries of the ego dissolve, and the individual merges seamlessly into a larger collective consciousness. Durkheim called this phenomenon collective effervescence. This dual nature is not a cultural accident, it is the direct result of our evolutionary history. We are primates who have developed a hidden, highly conditional capacity to function like bees. The human mind contains a mechanism that, when activated under the right circumstances, completely shuts down our Glauconian obsession with reputation and our Machiavellian pursuit of self-interest. This mechanism can be thought of as a hive switch. Most of the time, the switch is set to the default position of the selfish, individualistic primate. But when the switch is flipped, we transcend our ordinary selves. We become intensely cooperative, hyper-attuned to the needs of the group, and capable of profound, joyous self-sacrifice. To understand the deepest mysteries of human behavior, from the selflessness of soldiers in combat to the ecstatic devotion of religious congregations, one must understand how to flip this switch. The biology of the hive switch. Throughout history and across diverse cultures, humanity has intuitively discovered several reliable methods for bypassing the ego and activating the hive switch. The first and perhaps most ancient trigger is the experience of awe in nature. When confronted with vast, overwhelming natural phenomena, a towering redwood forest, a deep canyon, or a star-filled sky, the human mind undergoes a profound cognitive reset. The philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson famously articulated this sensation, describing how, when walking in the woods, all mean egotism vanishes and he becomes a transparent eyeball, part and parcel of a divine reality. In the modern era, astronauts frequently report a technologically induced version of this feeling known as the overview effect. Looking down at the fragile, glowing orb of the Earth from the silent expanse of space, they experience a crushing realization of human unity and a total evaporation of their individual earthly concerns. Awe acts as a solvent, melting away the boundaries of the self. A second trigger involves the deliberate alteration of brain chemistry through the use of specific substances. For millennia, traditional societies have utilized entheogens, mind-altering plants and fungi, not for recreational escape, but as sacraments to facilitate communion with the sacred. Clinical research involving compounds like psilocybin reveals that, when administered in controlled, supportive environments, these substances reliably induce profound mystical experiences. Subjects frequently report an overwhelming sense of interconnectedness, a feeling that the universe is alive, and a complete dissolution of their personal identity. These experiences are not merely chemical illusions. They are profound, lasting psychological events that temporarily disable the brain's default mode network, the neurological system responsible for our ceaseless self-referential chatter. When the self is quieted, the hive mentality rushes in. A third, highly accessible trigger is synchronized physical movement. The historian William McNeill documented the profound psychological impact of what he called muscular bonding. When human beings move together rhythmically, whether it is an army marching in perfect step, a choir singing in tight harmony, or thousands of youth dancing to the relentless beat of a rave, the physical boundaries between individuals begin to blur. Synchronized movement physically alters the neurochemistry of the brain, generating intense feelings of euphoria and belonging. It transforms a mere gathering of individuals into a singular breathing organism. This capacity for collective bonding is heavily mediated by specific biological systems, most notably the hormone oxytocin. Popular science has often mischaracterized oxytocin as a universal cuddle hormone, suggesting that its release makes us unconditionally loving and peaceful toward all of humanity. The biological reality is far more complex and dangerous. Oxytocin does indeed facilitate immense trust, empathy, and bonding, but it does so almost exclusively within the boundaries of the in-group. It is the chemical foundation of parochial love. It binds a mother to her child, and it binds a soldier to his squad. Crucially, as oxytocin increases our devotion to our own tribe, it simultaneously heightens our defensive aggression and suspicion toward rival groups. Similarly, our neurological capacity for empathy, driven by systems such as mirror neurons, is fundamentally tribal. We naturally mirror the emotions and internalize the suffering of those we consider us. However, when we observe the suffering of those we have categorized as them, our empathetic networks go dark. In competitive situations, we may even experience a surge of pleasure at the pain of a rival. The biology of the hive switch does not engineer universal brotherhood. It engineers fierce, localized cooperation that can easily be mobilized for intergroup conflict. In sum, we are conditional hive creatures. We spend the vast majority of our lives operating as self-interested individuals, utilizing our reasoning to justify our desires and guard our reputations. Yet, buried within our evolutionary architecture is a switch capable of silencing the ego and merging us with a larger whole. Through experiences of immense awe, the strategic use of mind-altering substances, or the rhythmic synchronization of muscular bonding, we can temporarily transcend our primate nature. This biological capacity for collective effervescence, heavily regulated by parochial hormones like oxytocin, explains both the highest peaks of human self-sacrifice and the darkest valleys of tribal violence. Recognizing the existence of this hive switch is essential for understanding why modern, secular life often feels atomized and unfulfilling, and why people will always seek out the profound, intoxicating relief of losing themselves within a righteous group. Chapter 11. Religion is a team sport. In recent years, a fierce intellectual movement known as the New Atheism has swept through the literary and scientific landscapes. Led by brilliant thinkers, this movement has forcefully argued that religion is not merely an outdated superstition, but a dangerous, parasitic delusion. They frequently compare religion to a mind virus, a destructive meme that infects the human brain, causing otherwise rational individuals to commit atrocious acts or violently oppress marginalized groups. For the New Atheists, the primary mystery of religion is why anyone, in an age of advanced modern science, would continue to harbor such patently absurd beliefs about invisible beings. However, by focusing almost entirely on the supernatural beliefs of the individual, they fundamentally misunderstand the evolutionary architecture of religion. To understand faith, one must stop looking solely at the individual believer and start looking at the group. The lone believer. The New Atheist model of religion is heavily grounded in the perspective of the lone believer. They correctly point out that human beings are neurologically predisposed to detect agency, because it was far safer for our ancestors to mistake the rustling of wind in the bushes for a hidden predator than to mistake a predator for the wind. We evolved a hyperactive mechanism for detecting intention. We naturally project human-like minds, goals, and faces onto the inanimate world. The New Atheists argue that religion is simply a psychological misfiring. an accidental byproduct of this cognitive module. In their view, the human mind accidentally invented gods, and then these infectious ideas hijacked our brains, leading to wasteful sacrifices and endless destructive wars. This byproduct theory is half correct. It accurately describes the initial cognitive spark of supernatural belief, but it completely fails to explain the massive, enduring structure of organized religion. If religion were merely a costly, useless parasite, natural selection would have ruthlessly eliminated the highly religious individuals, heavily favoring the pragmatic skeptics who conserved their resources rather than sacrificing their crops on altars. To understand why religion survived and flourished across human history, we must move beyond the lone believer and recognize that the accidental byproduct of supernatural thinking was eventually harnessed for a profound evolutionary purpose. The Durkheimian story: byproducts, then maypoles. The true evolutionary story of religion requires combining the initial byproduct theory with a Durkheimian understanding of group selection. Imagine a village preparing for a traditional festival. In the center of the town, they erect a large, colorful wooden pole, a maypole. Intrinsically, the pole is just a dead piece of wood. It possesses no magical powers and performs no physical labor. If a solitary person were observed bowing to it or speaking to it in isolation, they would be deemed insane. However, when the entire community gathers to dance around the maypole, moving in synchronized rhythm and holding colorful ribbons, the pole serves an indispensable function. It provides the central focal point that coordinates the entire social gathering, transforming a chaotic crowd into a unified whole. The gods operate in precisely the same manner. Once early humans accidentally conceived of supernatural agents, these shared beliefs became the ultimate maypoles. When an entire tribe agrees to revere the same sacred objects, fear the same divine punishments, and participate in the same rhythmic rituals, they undergo a profound transformation. Religion functions as a social exoskeleton. It binds the community together, severely limiting the corrosive effects of selfishness and free riding. If a tribe genuinely believes that an all-seeing deity is monitoring their behavior and will eternally punish traitors, they become dramatically more cooperative and trustworthy toward one another. A fascinating analysis of 19th century communal settlements vividly illustrates this point. When researchers compared secular communes to religiously motivated ones, the data revealed a stark contrast. The secular communes, bound only by shared ideals of equality or collective ownership, consistently collapsed within a few years due to internal disputes and a lack of profound commitment. The religious communes, however, survived significantly longer. Their intense rituals, strict behavioral codes, and shared sacred narratives generated a level of trust and mutual sacrifice that secular ideologies simply could not replicate. Religion is not a delusion that parasitizes the mind. It is an incredibly effective, evolved technology that allows human groups to function like a cohesive hive, successfully outcompeting less unified groups. Religion, fundamentally, is a team sport. The definition of morality, at last. Throughout this exploration into the righteous mind, we have seen that the prevailing definitions of morality in the academic world are overwhelmingly narrow, confined to the weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic obsession with protecting autonomous individuals from harm and ensuring absolute fairness. Such definitions completely fail to capture the moral realities of the vast majority of human cultures, both past and present. They ignore the binding foundations of loyalty, authority, and sanctity, and they dismiss the fundamentally groupish nature of our evolutionary design. A comprehensive, scientifically accurate definition of morality must reflect the reality of human nature as both strategically selfish and profoundly groupish. Morality cannot be reduced to a single logical rule or a simple utilitarian calculation. Instead, morality is defined as an interlocking set of values, virtues, norms, practices, identities, institutions, technologies, and evolved psychological mechanisms that work together to suppress or regulate self-interest and make cooperative societies possible. This definition deliberately refrains from specifying what the ideal society should look like. It does not dictate that a moral society must prioritize equality above all else, nor does it mandate that it must prioritize rigid tradition. Rather, it functionally describes what morality actually does. Morality is the essential human apparatus that binds individuals into functional teams, enables massive cooperation, and generates the necessary social trust to prevent us from tearing each other apart. By understanding this, we can finally begin to see the competing moral matrices of our political and religious rivals not as manifestations of pure evil or baffling ignorance, but as different, fully realized systems designed to solve the eternal human challenge of living together. Chapter 12. Can't we all disagree more constructively? Politics ain't beanbag, declared a Chicago humorist in the late 19th century. The phrase has long been used to justify the ruthless, combative nature of the American political process. It is not a gentle game for children. It is a contact sport driven by trickery, demagoguery, and the relentless effort to paint one's opponents as naive fools or corrupt villains. Rationalists might cling to the utopian fantasy that public policy should be meticulously engineered by panels of dispassionate, unbiased experts. But in the real world of human nature, there is no escaping the fierce competition to win the votes and resources of the masses. And yet, one must ask, does the contest have to be this venomous? Many observers have pointed out that the political climate has grown uniquely toxic in recent decades. The country feels fundamentally polarized, gridlocked, and embattled. The electorate itself has slowly drifted away from the center, but this shift among voters is mild compared to the extreme polarization that has captured the political class and the media. In the past, legislators from opposing parties could fiercely debate the issues on the floor and then share a friendly meal with their families over the weekend. They treated one another as members of an elite collegial club. However, the atmosphere shifted drastically toward the end of the 20th century. Social connections across party lines were systematically discouraged. The deployment of opposition research to unearth and broadcast personal scandals became a permanent feature of the landscape. Politics transformed into a form of tribal gang warfare, where members approach the legislative chamber consumed by hatred. The stakes are immense, and as the nation faces monumental challenges, the crew of the ship seems far too busy attacking one another to bother plugging the leaks. A note about political diversity. To understand how to navigate this hostility, it is necessary to re-evaluate the concept of political diversity. In ancient Chinese philosophy, the universe is understood through the interplay of yin and yang, opposing but entirely complementary forces. Night and day, male and female, summer and winter. One cannot exist without the other, and a healthy system requires their continuous dynamic balance. However, the ancient Middle East gave rise to a very different metaphor, the battle between light and absolute darkness. In the Manichaean worldview, the universe is a war zone between absolute good and absolute evil, and every individual must choose a side. Compromise with the devil is an unforgivable sin. When political partisans adopt this Manichaean framework, they view their opponents not as the necessary yin to their yang, but as a demonic force that must be utterly eradicated. To cure this political disease, we must recognize that liberal and conservative moralities are not arbitrary or pathological. They are manifestations of deeply conflicting but equally necessary visions of a good society. The liberal moral matrix, built heavily on the care and fairness foundations, makes liberals the experts at detecting victims of systemic oppression. They possess a crucial sensitivity to the suffering of those marginalized by traditional social arrangements, and they continuously push the society to invent new, more humane structures. They recognize that unregulated markets and massive corporate entities can act as predatory superorganisms, demanding government intervention to protect the vulnerable. Conservatives, conversely, possess a broader moral matrix that relies on all 6 moral foundations, including loyalty, authority, and sanctity. This broader matrix makes them the experts at detecting threats to the moral capital of a society, the delicate, interlocking networks of institutions, traditions, and norms that suppress human selfishness and make large-scale cooperation possible. They understand that you do not help the bees by destroying the hive. They recognize that free markets, despite their flaws, are miraculous engines of spontaneous order and human prosperity. A healthy nation requires both the progressive urge to liberate the oppressed and the conservative urge to protect the institutions that sustain moral order. From genas to moral matrices. How does an individual end up embracing one of these moral visions over the other? For decades, political scientists assumed that people voted primarily based on their rational, economic self-interest. But the data reveals a different reality. People vote for the political team that aligns with their moral identity. To trace the origin of these political identities, one must go back to the very beginning, long before a child can articulate a political opinion. It begins with genetics. Step 1. Genes make brains. The human mind is not a blank slate waiting for society to inscribe a political ideology upon it. Behavioral geneticists, studying thousands of pairs of twins separated at birth and raised in different environments, have repeatedly demonstrated that virtually every personality trait is highly heritable. Identical twins raised apart are remarkably similar in their political orientations, while fraternal twins are not. This does not mean that there is a specific gene for voting Republican or Democratic. Rather, genes provide the instructions for constructing the developing brain, determining the sensitivity of various neural receptors and the flow of neurotransmitters. These minute biological differences produce deep variations in fundamental temperament. Some brains are wired to experience a stronger surge of pleasure when exposed to novelty, variety, and new experiences. People with these brains score high on the personality trait known as openness to experience, and they are naturally drawn to the liberal embrace of diversity and progressive change. Other brains are wired to be more reactive to signs of threat, danger, and disgust. People with these brains are deeply comforted by order, tradition, and familiarity. They are naturally drawn to the conservative emphasis on stability, boundaries, and the protection of the in-group. Step 2. Traits guide children along different paths. These innate temperamental differences are not the end of the story. They are merely the beginning of a lifelong trajectory. The psychologist Dan McAdams points out that personality consists of multiple levels. The first level consists of these basic genetic traits like openness to experience or threat sensitivity. The second level consists of characteristic adaptations, the specific skills, habits, and coping mechanisms that a person develops as their innate traits interact with their specific environment. A child with a high degree of openness to experience will naturally gravitate toward different peer groups, different academic interests, and different forms of entertainment than a child who is highly sensitive to threat. As they navigate the challenges of adolescence, the open child will develop characteristic adaptations that make them increasingly comfortable questioning authority and challenging traditional norms. The threat-sensitive child will develop adaptations that make them value rules, respect hierarchical structures, and seek the safety of loyal, cohesive teams. Through this continuous interaction between genetic predispositions and environmental feedback, children gradually maneuver themselves into different social and psychological worlds. Step 3. People construct life narratives. As young adults, people reach the third level of personality, the construction of a life narrative. Human beings are storytellers. We make sense of our chaotic lives by weaving our past, present, and anticipated future into a coherent, emotionally compelling narrative. The political left and right offer ready-made grand narratives that perfectly resonate with the characteristic adaptations these young adults have developed. The liberal progress narrative tells a story of heroic liberation. In this story, the past was a dark age of tyranny, prejudice, and patriarchal oppression. The noble struggle of history is the fight to dismantle these oppressive structures and emancipate the victims, marching toward a future of universal equality and social justice. This narrative sings to the soul of the young adult who is highly open to experience and deeply attuned to the care and fairness foundations. The conservative narrative, on the other hand, is a story of heroism and decline. In this story, our brave ancestors forged a glorious, well-ordered society grounded in traditional values, personal responsibility, and divine order. But this hard-won moral capital is constantly under threat from reckless utopian reformers and cultural decay. The noble struggle of history is the fight to preserve the sanctity of the family, the honor of the nation, and the wisdom of the past against the forces of moral entropy. This narrative profoundly resonates with the young adult who values order and relies heavily on the loyalty, authority, and sanctity foundations. Once an individual accepts one of these grand narratives, it becomes their reality. They step into the moral matrix and they become entirely blind to the virtues and insights of the opposing camp. Toward more civil politics. If we are to pull our society back from the brink of extreme polarization, we must consciously strive to abandon the Manichaean mindset. We are increasingly living in isolated, ideologically pure echo chambers. The phenomenon known as the big sort demonstrates that citizens are physically moving into neighborhoods and communities surrounded entirely by like-minded individuals. If you live in a dense urban center, shop at organic grocery stores, and consume liberal media, your matrix is constantly reinforced. If you live in a rural county, shop at traditional stores, and attend a conservative church, your matrix is equally absolute. When we interact only with those who share our exact moral taste buds, our opponents cease to look like fellow citizens and begin to look like monsters. Resolving this crisis cannot be achieved simply by asking people to sign civility pledges or by demanding that the conscious rider logic its way to a compromise. The rider is merely the press secretary for the emotional elephant. If the elephant is leaning away in a posture of hostile defense, the rider will invariably find a reason to reject the opponent's argument. To foster genuine political civility, we must alter the environments and the procedures that govern our political interactions. We must focus on the relationships between people. If you can establish a genuine human connection with someone across the political divide, if you can share a meal, discover a common interest, or simply listen with an open heart, you alter the posture of the elephant. When the elephant leans forward in friendship, the rider becomes open to the possibility that the other side possesses a legitimate moral concern. In sum, we are multiple from the start. We are born with a complex evolutionary architecture, a righteous mind equipped with an array of distinct moral taste receptors. We are the descendants of primates who survived by fiercely competing as individuals, but we are also the descendants of ancestors who discovered the magic of crossing the Rubicon into shared intentionality, learning to suppress their selfishness and operate as a cohesive hive. This dual nature guarantees that our moral and political lives will always be fraught with conflict. The political left and right are not the forces of absolute good and evil. They are the natural expressions of different configurations of our innate moral foundations. By recognizing that our righteous minds were designed by evolution to unite us into teams, to divide us against other teams, and to blind us to the truth, we can finally step back from the battle. We can recognize the profound miracle of human civilization and the absolute necessity of both the liberal and conservative moral visions. The great human project is not to eradicate the other side, but to embrace the full spectrum of our moral capacities, taking the logs out of our own eyes and learning to live together on this earth while we are stuck here.